Hello and welcome to Indus News live from Islamabad. I am Munib Hamid with the news of this hour. Let's begin with the headlines first. "25 people have been killed and 2 others critically injured in a military plane crash in northeastern Ukraine. The Interior Ministry said the aircraft crashed while landing during a training exercise. It said 20 Air Force University cadets and 7 crew members were among the 27 people on board. Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan has urged the world to probe crimes against humanity in Indian-occupied Kashmir. In a video addressed to the United Nations General Assembly, Khan said the global body must ensure Kashmiris get the right to self-determination. Touching upon other issues, the Prime Minister said Pakistan supports an Afghan-led peace process. Referring to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, the Prime Minister called for a 2-state solution in line with United Nations resolutions. He also urged the United Nations to act against rising Islamophobia. Beijing has accused Washington of maliciously slandering its diplomatic missions and staff in the U.S. China's Foreign Ministry spokesperson Wang Wenbin urged the U.S. to stop the smear campaign, saying Washington is provoking trouble. Beijing's rebuke comes after U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo accused China's General Consulate in New York of conducting espionage. Greece has expressed optimism over holding talks with Turkey to find a diplomatic solution to the tensions in the eastern Mediterranean. In his address to the UN General Assembly, Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis said he hopes to forge a partnership between the rival neighbours. India's COVID-19 cases have crossed 5.9 million with a spike of over 85,000 infections and 1,089 deaths in the last 24 hours. The number of coronavirus cases in France have surpassed 1 million after recording nearly 150,000 infections in the past 2 days. In Pakistan, 7 people have died overnight, taking the toll to 6,451 with more than 309,000 cases. The pandemic has infected over 32 million people worldwide and claimed more than 987,000 lives. News coming in detail after a short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Now let's have the news in detail. 25 people have been killed and 2 others critically injured in a military plane crash in northeastern Syria. Ukraine, I beg your pardon. The Interior Ministry said the aircraft crashed while landing during a training exercise. It said 20 Air Force University cadets and 7 crew members were among the 27 people on board. In a statement, the State Emergency Service of Ukraine said the crash happened around 2 kilometers from a military airport. Kharkiv city's governor said 1 pilot reported failure in the left engine of the plane as some of the pupils managed to jump at the lower altitude.
We were driving to Shahuiv and a plane fell right before us. We don't know why. A burning man ran outside. A car drove to the place. They took out a fire extinguisher and started putting out fire. Then there came another one. He had his head cut. He was pulled to that side. They put out the fire on the one that was burning.
President Volodymyr Zelensky's office said he will visit the crash site while also announcing an investigation into the disaster. Now, Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan has called on the world to probe crimes against humanity in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir. In a video address to the United Nations General Assembly, Khan said the global body must ensure that Kashmiris get their right to self-determination. This report has more details.
Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan highlighted the core issues of the region while addressing the 75th UN General Assembly session. Khan said India is being ruled by an extremist ideology which believes in the ethnic cleansing of minorities, especially Muslims. He said the Kashmir dispute has been rightly described as a nuclear flashpoint, adding that India has put a legislation in place to alter the demographics of the occupied valley. The Premier said this is a war crime under the 4th Geneva Convention.
Despite constant Indian provocations and ceasefire violations along the line of control and the working boundary, targeting innocent civilians, Pakistan has exercised maximum restraint. We have consistently sensitized the world community about a false flag operation and another ill-conceived misadventure by India. I want to make it clear that any attempt by the fascist, totalitarian, RSS-led Indian government to aggress against Pakistan will be met by a nation that will fight for its freedom to the end.
Referring to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, the Prime Minister called for a two-state solution in line with UN resolutions. The Prime Minister said Pakistan played a vital role in Afghan peace process and expressed full support for ongoing talks in Doha.
Pakistan fully facilitated the process that culminated in the US-Taliban peace agreement on 29 February 2020. Pakistan is deeply gratified that it has fulfilled its part of the responsibility. The Afghan leaders must now seize this historic opportunity to achieve reconciliation.
He said the coronavirus pandemic was an opportunity to bring humanity together, but it has instead fanned nationalism and given rise to racial and religious hatred and violence against vulnerable minorities in several places.
The one country in the world today where I'm sad to say the state sponsors Islamophobia, and that is India. The reason behind this is the RSS ideology that unfortunately rules India today. This extremist ideology was founded in the 1920s. The RSS founding fathers were inspired by the Nazis, and they adopted their concepts of racial purity and supremacy. While the Nazis' hate was directed at the Jews, the RSS directs it towards the Muslims and to a lesser extent, the Christians.
Prime Minister also urged the implementation of the Paris Accord to curb climate change. He said the UN should be made fully responsive to the challenges of contemporary times.
Pakistan has strongly condemned the murder of prominent Kashmiri lawyer and activist Babar Qadri in Srinagar. In a statement, the Foreign Office said another voice critical of Indian atrocities in occupied Kashmir has been silenced through extrajudicial killing. Qadri was shot on Thursday evening at his home in Srinagar by unidentified gunmen posing as clients. He was rushed to a hospital where doctors declared him dead. Qadri was an outspoken debater on Indian television where he would defend Kashmir's right to self-determination. Pakistan has called for an international probe into the unabated killings of Kashmiris in the occupied valley. Meanwhile, Indian media has revealed that many Indian individuals and companies are involved in suspected money laundering, drug dealings, terrorism and financial fraud. The media quoted US financial watchdog's leaked report saying several suspicious activity reports have been filed against the Indian entities. An investigation has revealed transactions of entities including Global Diamond firm owned by Indians and a sponsor of the Indian Premier League team. In a majority of cases, domestic branches of Indian banks have been utilized to receive or remit the funds to foreign banks. These cases are also being investigated by the Central Bureau of Investigation, the Enforcement Directorate and the Directorate of Revenue Intelligence. The investigative team say their reporting has exposed how banks and regulators have failed the public by allowing the flow of dirty money to go unchecked. Now, at least 7 Palestinians have been injured after Israeli forces used rubber bullets on protesters in the occupied West Bank. The protesters were demonstrating against settlements building in the occupied territory. A journalist covering the demonstrations was also hit by the rubber bullets fired by the Israeli forces. The demonstrators held protests in the town of Kafr Kadum, north of the West Bank. Israel occupied Jerusalem and the West Bank following the 1967 Six-Day War and began establishing settlements in the area. Moving on, Beijing has accused Washington of maliciously slandering its diplomatic missions and staff in the United States. At a briefing, China's Foreign Ministry spokesperson Wang Wenbin urged the U.S. to stop the smear campaign, saying Washington is provoking trouble. Wang said Beijing's diplomats strictly adhere to the international law. He said Washington should fulfill its obligations under the diplomatic code and agreements between both the nations. Beijing's rebuke comes after U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo accused China's general consulate in the New York City of conducting espionage. In recent months, both countries have been involved in tit-for-tat closures of consulates and media outlets. Meanwhile, Russia says the United States' presence in war-torn Syria is illegal. Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Vershinin said Washington's presence in Syria, Al Jazeera and the Al Tanaf region is unlawful. In an interview, Vershinin said the continued plunder of Syrian national wealth such as oil was totally unacceptable. He said despite differences over several issues, Moscow is in contact with Washington in Syria through military diplomatic channels. Earlier, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and his Iranian counterpart Mohammad Javad Zarif said any foreign presence in Syria without the country's consent violates international law. Lavrov said the presence of foreign troops in Syria is in breach of the United Nations Security Council resolutions number 22 and 254. Russia says it has intercepted 2 U.S. bombers approaching its airspace over the Baltic Sea. Russia's National Defense Management Center said the Sukhoi 27 fighters from the country's Baltic fleet cut off the targets. The center said the jets approached the U.S. Air Force B-52H bombers at a safe distance. It said the entire flights of the Russian fighters proceeded in strict compliance with the international rules of using the airspace. The center said the Russian pilots did not let the intruding aircraft violate the Russian borders. Meanwhile, Russia's military chief Valery Gerasimov said the U.S. and NATO are conducting military drills close to the Russian border. Now, Russian President Vladimir Putin has observed the Kavkaz 2020 military drills taking place in the southern Astrakhan region. In a statement, the Defense Ministry said the drills focus on combating cruise missiles and unmanned aerial vehicles. It said the exercises involve around 1,000 military personnel from Armenia, Belarus, China, Myanmar and Pakistan. The exercises will be observed by representatives of Azerbaijan, Indonesia, Iran, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan and Sri Lanka. The ministry said the drills will involve around 80,000 personnel, including Russian missile defense and Navy units. It said the drills will also feature up to 250 tanks, 450 military personnel carriers and 200 artillery systems. Now, Greece has expressed optimism over holding talks with Turkey to find a diplomatic solution to the tensions in the eastern Mediterranean. In his address at the UN General Assembly, Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis said he hopes to forge a partnership between the rival neighbours. Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis said he is ready to cooperate with Turkey and act as a bridge builder for Ankara and Europe. Referring to the start of the exploratory talks between Turkey and Greece, Mitsotakis said it is a step in the right direction. He decried the escalation of tension, saying the partnership between close neighbours remains a possibility. The Greek Premier said both states should consult with the International Court of Justice to solve the outstanding issues if the talks fail. Meanwhile, authorities in Turkey have issued arrest warrants for 82 people over pro-Kurdish protests 6 years ago. In a statement, Ankara Chief Public Prosecutor's Office said police were on the hunt for the suspects in the Turkish capital and 6 other provinces. The prosecutor's office said crimes committed during the protests included murder, attempted murder, theft and damaging property. It said 326 security officials and 435 citizens were injured during those protests. A warrant was also issued for Mayor of Kars City, Ahyan Bilgen. The October 2014 protest in Turkey was sparked by ISIS seizure of mainly Kurdish Syrian town of Kobane. Moving on, Ethiopia says it has no intention of harming Sudan and Egypt with its plan to build the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam on the Blue Nile River. In his address at the UN General Assembly, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed said Ethiopia is committed to finding a mutually beneficial outcome. Ahmed said his government will address the concerns of downstream countries in the ongoing African Union-led process. The three states have so far failed to strike a deal on the operation of the controversial dam before Ethiopia began filling the reservoir in July. Ahmed said Ethiopia only wants to meet the electricity demands of over 65 million people in the country.
I want to make it abundantly clear that we have no intention to harm these countries. What we are essentially doing is to meet our electricity demands from one of the cleanest source of energy. We cannot afford to continue keeping more than 65 million of our people in the dark.
Meanwhile, Egypt has rejected the monopoly of Ethiopia on the Nile, saying it is dependent on the river for over 90% of its scarce freshwater supplies. Now it's time for a short break. Stay tuned with Indus News. Welcome back. Now, India's COVID-19 cases have crossed 5.9 million, with a spike of over 85,000 infections and 1,089 deaths in the last 24 hours. The number of coronavirus cases in France has passed 500,000 after recording nearly 150,000 infections in the past 2 days. The pandemic has infected over 32 million worldwide and claimed more than 987,000 lives. More details in this report.
Around the world, stricter social distancing guidelines and restrictions on businesses are being brought into effect to curb a second spike. But in contrast, curbs on businesses are being lifted in some US states, despite the increasing number of cases nationwide. The World Health Organization has warned that the global COVID-19 death toll can hit 2 million before an effective vaccine is widely used. The health body said the figure can be higher without concerted international action.
As far as we are concerned, and so far, as you know, all the publications we have seen, the publications say it's actually something, the virus has happened naturally. It came naturally. So these are all the publications we know.
In Spain, the government has recommended reimposing a partial lockdown on all of Madrid area, where cases have risen sharply. More restrictions have been announced in several regions of the UK as new daily infections continue to rise. Meanwhile, Australia says it has been able to restore about half the jobs it lost during the economic crisis caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. Speaking remotely from Sydney, Prime Minister Scott Morrison said Australia has fared better than most in terms of the death toll.
Our COVID-19 case and fatality rates are a fraction of those across the globe. And while our economy has not been spared the blow of recession, our first in almost 30 years in Australia, the impact has been far less than almost every other developed economy in the world. Almost half the jobs that we had lost to the virus early on have been already recovered.
South Korea's new cases fell below 100 for the first time in 4 days as the country is struggling with sporadic cluster infections in the Greater Seoul area. Mainland China reported 50 new COVID-19 cases compared with 8 cases announced a day earlier.
Meanwhile, in Pakistan, 7 people have died overnight due to the COVID-19, taking the toll to 6,451. The Health Ministry reported 566 new infections since yesterday, raising the number of active cases to nearly 8,000. The ministry said with a 95% recovery rate, over 295,000 patients have recovered from the disease. Sindh is still the most hit province with more than 135,000 infections, while over 98,000 cases have been reported in Punjab province so far. The National Command and Operations Centre said 735 hospitals are providing facilities to 874 patients admitted across the country. Now, Japan says it will gradually start allowing entry to foreigners with newly issued long-term visas from October. The restrictions imposed following the coronavirus outbreak in Japan had prevented visa holders from re-entering. Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga said the relaxation will be applied to foreigners with the appropriate visas from countries where the virus has subsided. He said they will be required to test for coronavirus before they are allowed into the country. Economy Minister Yasutoshike Nishimura said Tokyo will proceed after negotiating with countries on a bilateral basis. Japan managed to avoid an extreme outbreak seen in hard-hit countries with over 80,000 infections and more than 1,500 deaths. Now in Germany, thousands of protesters have demonstrated on the streets of Berlin against government's inaction on the climate crisis. Youth activist movement Fridays for Future had given the global climate strike call once again. Protesters cycled in groups to the city's landmark of the Brandenburg Gate for a rally. German climate activist Luisa Neubauer said climate justice was possible as long as they did not give up. She said they will keep pushing the government for action. Similar demonstrations were planned in over 3,100 locations worldwide. Now, the British government says it has borrowed almost $46 billion in August during the global financial crisis amid the pandemic. This has pushed the country's national debt up to a record $2.58 trillion. United Kingdom's Office for National Statistics said the total amount borrowed in the first 5 months of the fiscal year was almost $221 billion. It said this is the highest figure since records began at the Statistics Office in 1993. The office said the government's borrowing in August was less than the Office for Budget Responsibility's prediction earlier this year. It had been forecast that borrowing for the financial year could be as high as $509 billion. Coronavirus has hit the world economy hard, particularly the airline industry. This has led to mass redundancies and slashed routes all across the globe. Forced to find inventive ways to recover, South Korea's national flag carrier Korean Air has transformed 2 of its air passenger aircraft into cargo carriers. Details in this report.
The situation Korean Air is facing is not too dissimilar from what ails the rest of the world. Among other problems, the company is reeling through cash starvation. General Manager Shim Jae-woo says the international travel has reduced considerably following the pandemic.
Fewer tickets are being sold, operating loss and poor cash flow are the biggest blow to our company.
Despite travel being reduced, consumption has not waned as air freight rates are up amid COVID-19. This has created a small window of opportunity for airlines to bag some profit.
Impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, converting passenger jets into cargo carriers puts more airplanes into use and helps generate additional revenue.
Another South Korean major flag carrier, Asiana Airlines, has also overhauled 3 of its passenger aircrafts to transport cargoes. The conversions might give a little relief to the struggling airlines, but it takes time for the industry to completely recover from the losses.
Now let's have a look at the weather updates across the globe. Well, that is all for now. For the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at Indus.News. Take care.